Hello, welcome. My name is Edwin Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and in this video, I present part 3 to the general introduction of Edwin Johnson's Rise of English Culture. The rest of the videos in this series can be found in the playlist dedicated to this book on the Ctruth YouTube channel. Without further ado, here is my audiobook version. Let me close by referring to his treatment of a scholar whose significance has never been duly appreciated as a critic of the monks, that is, Lorenzo Valla, the Latin scholar and humanist. Hallam sees that this scholar, in his declamation against the donation of Constantine and the temporal power of the Pope, is in effect an ally of Luther, and writes in the same violent strain. Had the slight story of Valla's life, which refers him to the 15th century, been neglected, and the date of publication of his writings been attended to, about 1543, it would have been seen that beneath the mask of Lorenzo Valla is in fact hidden an ally of the reformers. In the same way, the statement in the work on the elegances of Latin to the effect that these classical principles are novel, and that for many ages none had been able to speak or to read Latin, is only fully appreciated when you trace it to a writer of the early 16th century. It may be too strong, and yet it cannot be much weakened, for it is the unanimous witness of the more competent men of the time. To Valla also are ascribed the earliest notes on the Greek Testament, which was not, as Hallam believed in compliance with the church tradition, the original text of the canonical writings. Now, Valla, though competent to feel the many inelegancies of the Latin version, has been shown to have but slight knowledge of Greek. To later scholars, it appeared that he had by no means the perfection even in Latin, for which he might have taken credit to himself amidst the barbarism and ignorance which prevailed around him. If, among the enthusiasts for classical purity, few as they were, and all too fulsome as they were in their mutual admiration, such was the state of things 400 years ago, the accurate student may judge how it fared in the monasteries, in which men were laboring not to lead, but merely not to lag behind the beginning march of education. The best Latin and Greek writing ascribed to the Fathers is contemporary with or later than Valla, nor is there any reason to suppose that the oldest and rudest manuscripts of portions of the Latin Gospels date from very many decades before the rise of such humanists as the notable man whom we salute as the enemy of fictions in the monastic and papal interest. I have thus endeavored to prepare the mind of the reader for a fresh consideration of the evidence, and for a conclusion which must come upon the unprepared mind with a shock of surprise. The histories put forward by the monks at the epoch of publication were none of them narratives based upon authentic records of the past. They were plausible inventions, agreeable to the sentiments of the classes for whom they were written. The monks knew the actual state of the world. They were interested above all things in the dominion and glory of their own order, in the utter ignorance which prevailed, and in the all but perfect immunity from contradiction on the part of outsiders until the great schism occurred. They traced up the rise of the Church to causes in the far distant past. They fixed on certain epochs from which they dated beginnings, and again new beginnings. They gradually revealed a long imaginary retrospect to the mind of their readers. They worked consistently with their rule in collaboration. They distributed the task of filling in the great scheme among different members. They thus produced an impression of a great mass and of general consistency of plan, amidst many and often designed discrepancies, similar to that produced by their architecture. They subjugated the imagination of the world. Some resistance was made to their impositions on the part of scholars of a better taste for the truth, which proved ineffectual under the conditions of the time, and the passionate credulity which prevailed in all classes. The compiler of the monastic inventions have far outnumbered the critics, and have, in the eyes of the unthinking, overwhelmed them. And, if faith in the monks is now generally giving way, it is less due to the efforts of solitary men of ability and character than to the insensible prevalence of habits of thought which are incompatible with faith. Such, in brief, is the truth concerning English story, and in general the story of the West, as it began to be told about 400 years ago. I might detain the reader at great length in noticing a large number of distinguished men, who from the Tudor period down to that of the Fathers of St. Maur, and since have busied themselves in compiling without understanding the writings of the old Benedictines. But it may be of some interest if I refer to a few names of writers who lived in our own times. The Comte de Montalembert has given a very interesting review of Benedictine legends in his voluminous work on the monks of the West. He entered upon his task with a strong sentiment of reverence and sympathy towards the founders of Christianity. He approached its close, as I believe, with some weariness, and with something like disgust at the avarice and ambition of men who had arrogated to themselves the character of men of God and friends of the poor. The stern censures of so devout and so believing a man, for he appears to credit their miracles in the most childlike spirit, are exceedingly impressive. But whatever high qualities we expect and find in the work of M. de Montalembert, the critical investigation of his sources was to him an impossibility, nor is there a word of authentic record to be found from beginning to end of his volumes. Our countryman, Dean Milman, was a man of enlightened and philosophic mind. He too, in his Latin Christianity, addressed himself to the laborious compilation of Benedictine tales. It is a work tedious to peruse, which leaves upon the truly aroused and attentive reader the impression of the utter unlifelikeness of the whole series of the lives of the popes, by which it was sought to fill up the vast space of 1500 years. He will say to himself, with the experience of these ages since the era of publication, or of human and ecclesiastical nature in general, that things never did and never could go on in that perpetual seesaw of progression and retrogression in this mundane scene. Milman did not investigate his sources. He did not ask himself when were these lines written. The scholar who sets himself seriously to answer that question and makes a speciality of the papal biographies will, I doubt not, arrive at the firm conclusion that not one of these biographies was attempted long before the time of Platina and of Stella, and that they have all been written upon the poetical basis and the deductive principle. A German scholar of high merit, who lately passed from us, Ferdinand Gregorovius, has also left behind him a voluminous compilation on the history of Rome in the Middle Ages. He rested mainly on the same Benedictine legends, and though writing as the friend of freedom and secular culture, was unable to strike at the root of the ramified fictions of the order. Yet the views of the state of letters which Gregorovius attempts at the close of each century are valuable to the critical student. Here, as in the corresponding pages of Hallam, you observe that after bursts of culture and bright gleams of awakening intelligence, darkness recurrently sets in, so that at the end of the 15th century the world appears scarce nearer to culture than it was after the calamities which are said to have occurred 1,000 or 500 years before. Once more, the Middle Ages are perceived to be no less a dream than any other temporal scheme of the fall and recovery of man. The proper use to make of Gregorovius, as of all the compilers, is to begin with his last volume, and thoroughly to digest the evidence there collected, which shows us how impossible it was for the scholars of the early 16th century to ascend with certain footsteps through even the dark age that had gone before, much less through any preceding time. To those who are aware of the necessity of taking a wide view for the purpose of understanding these matters, it will not seem impertinent if I refer to some masters in the art of historic fiction who have shed some sidelights on the nature of history. Let me name Henry Fielding as the founder of a new manner of writing, expressly based on the close study of human nature. It may be that his characters and scenes are no longer to our taste, but there can be no question of their fidelity to his time, nor of the conscientious intentions of the artist. Fielding was an admirable critic of human nature, and therefore of history. Such a man will aid us to understand by contrast the unreality of the romancers of the monasteries. Fielding points us to the prodigious variety in human nature, and freely scoffs at the centuries of monkish dullness when the world seems to have been asleep. He is conscious of the power to foretell action from character, and scarce refrains from the boast that he, as the student of human nature, is the earliest of our historians. Truth distinguishes our writings from those idle romances which are filled with monsters, the productions, not of nature, but of distempered brains. He will discuss with his readers the probability of some of his incidents, so anxious is he to keep close to the vast authentic book of nature. He lays down the rules which few who have thought themselves serious historians have carefully regarded. He will reject every circumstance which, though never so well attested, he must be well assured is false. Thus he may fall into the marvelous, but never into the incredible. Ironically, he draws the contrast between himself as a private historian and the public historian who is supported by records when he portrays men so very good and so very bad. He believes not in those extremes, nor in the sudden conversions of the bad into the good in popular drama. Fielding refers to the universal contempt cast upon historical writers who do not draw their material from records, and in so doing he slights English history. He refuses to call his work a romance for that reason. He has good authority for all his characters, no less indeed than Doomsday Book. He lavishes satire upon the pedants who have passed all their time in colleges and among books, and who are incompetent historians, because they have not conversed in the world with human nature as it is. He has never in the world met with the model of perfection, nor with the monster unredeemed by a single virtue. He flatly denies that virtue is the certain road to happiness, and vice to misery in this world. Again and again the contempt with which he regards alderman history and Monsieur Romance breaks out. It seems clear that he, with a taste so severely educated for truth, looked upon our history as a series of dull conventional tales, which certain droll authors have been facetiously pleased to call the history of England. The criticism of Fielding may be sweeping, but much nonsense still needs to be swept from the memory and imagination of the world. One of the greatest of all literary artists, Sir Walter Scott, has not only devoted 2 of his novels to the delineation of the life of a Benedictine monastery at the time of the Reformation. He has in other works drawn freely from the monastic legends. Sir Walter employed the soft and pleasing colors of which he was so great a master to illustrate the better aspects of the life of the monasteries. He protects against the harsh and partial judgments against them so commonly to be heard. The abbot and the monastery may, perhaps, be regarded as the best apologies on behalf of the monks ever written. Yet Scott was too extensively and too accurately read in his subject to represent any great learning as the property of the monasteries at the time of the Reformation or at any preceding period. He was well aware that any writing or reading class, whether within or without the cloisters, was of the smallest extent. a fact which, if it had been duly noted, would have saved much waste of labor in the study of English history. Honoré de Balzac, whose carefully labored fictions produce a deeper effect of reality upon the reader than any ordinary history, has sketched in one of his novels, Les Paysans, the portrait of a renegade and disfrocked Benedictine of our day. He presents the man as a type in French provincial life. It is no pleasing picture, the avarice, the hypocrisy, the greed and gluttony of one who has learned the science of egoism in the cloister. Profound as a monk, silentious as a Benedictine in historical labors, tricky as a priest, dissimulant as every miser, keeping always within the limits of the law, this man would have been Tiberius at Rome, Richelieu under Louis XIII, Fouché, had he been ambitious enough to go to the convention. But he had the wisdom to be a lowly Lucullus, a voluptuous miser. Balzac notes the insect-like patience due to the need of observing decorum and reserve which characterized those who had been under the ecclesiastical discipline of the monasteries, and who came forth into the world at the time of the Revolution. The discipline was long descended, and not vainly will the reader attend to the description of so consummate an observer of life as the French novelist, if he desires to understand the mind of the men who took upon themselves the task of writing French and English history about 400 years ago. That concludes part 3 of Edwin Johnson's general introduction, the final part of this chapter. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think about the video. Until next time, never stop seeking the truth about chronology.